Good morning, everyone. Oh, I don't know if this works too well, but I'm going to give it a shot. It is 2 days before Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. One of the common questions that I get asked by friends and coworkers and others that I know is why did I, at the age of 44, adopt a boy from the foster care system? Those of you who know me know my son Robert, who is now 20, a wonderful and just marvelous young guy. Um, but still, the question persists: why would I, as a middle-aged man, choose to adopt a 10-year-old boy who also had a mental disability and a really awful history um, from the foster care system? Um, I'd always wanted to have children. That was one of the goals that I had, and it just never worked out. I did not find myself in a position where becoming a father in the more conventional way was going to happen. And I'd pretty much given up on the idea. I just ended a relationship and I thought, well, that's it. Here I am. I'm 44 years old, halfway to dead. And what the hell am I going to do now? Was seeing a therapist at the time, and I mentioned that to her, and she said, well, why don't you adopt? And I said, me? I said, well, they wouldn't let me adopt. I'm a middle-aged man. And she said, of course they would. Sure they would. So I decided to make a call and see if it was true. Called an adoption agency in Atlanta, and yes, sure enough, uh, middle-aged single men could adopt children. So I made an appointment and went down to speak to them to see what it entailed. And it was not a difficult process, just a time-consuming one. I had to take a 10-week class once a week every Saturday morning for 4 hours, about 40 hours worth of training on being an adoptive parent. Had to get a police background check, fingerprinting, drug tests. Visitors had to come to my home on multiple occasions to check it out and see what they thought of me and my home, and finally go through an approval process with the agency. At which point, they then had me develop a matrix or go through a matrix that they had of what kind of child I would adopt. And there were some of the typical questions. You want a son or a daughter? Or would you want one child or multiple children? Would you consider adopting a group of children who were brothers and sisters? Um, age, race, um, physical condition, mental condition, etc. And so I had to kind of decide what type of child that I would take. Well, I didn't want to limit it to anything except for what I could reasonably deal with, the kind of a child that I thought I could reasonably take care of. So I felt that as a single man, I could take care of a child that did have a developmental disability of some kind, as long as it was not too severe. I just felt that if it was too severe, I would not have the wherewithal, both emotionally and as one person, to take care of it. So I said I would agree to adopting a boy, not a girl, with up to a mild level of developmental disability, and race would be white or Spanish, Latino, um, because if it was a white kid, I'm a white guy, and so we share an American culture. If he's a Spanish kid, well, I speak Spanish, lived in Spain, and I'm Roman Catholic, so he and I would also share a culture. I agreed that I would adopt a black boy, but only if he had no mental or physical disabilities, because I felt the challenge of adopting a black child would be big enough without having to face additional challenges with mental or physical disabilities that needed to be overcome. The way it worked then was I had to develop a portfolio on myself, have it approved by the agency, and then it was submitted to social workers in the foster care system, both here and, oddly enough, not just in Georgia, but in Ohio. And Georgia wasn't very forthcoming. They didn't get a lot of response from them. But Ohio pretty much immediately sent down a folder on a boy. The way it worked with the adoption agency is when they would get a file on a child, they would call you up and you'd come in and you'd review that file. And if you agreed that that was the child you wanted to adopt, you didn't see any other files, that was the child. If you did not consider that child to be the appropriate one, they would remove the file and you'd never get to see it again. They didn't want you to do a sort of compare and contrast thing where you'd have 3 or 4 files in front of you and you'd look through them to decide which one was the perfect child. So Robert was the first one, and I read his file, and there seemed to be an awful lot of issues. And I said to the agency, I'm not sure this kid's appropriate because he's got too many problems. I don't think I could take care of him. And their response was that they felt I should speak with the foster mom because they felt the file did not accurately reflect what kind of a kid Robert was. So I said, okay, I'll speak to the foster mom. So I called her and we spoke quite a lot, and she said that Robert was different than the child that was in the paperwork. Specifically, that he was not as severely incapacitated mentally, that his behavioral problems were not as egregious as they were described in the paperwork, and that he was actually a much more cooperative and amenable child than was described. A lot of the behaviors and issues that was in the paperwork came from an earlier period in his life. So we continued to have conversations for a couple of months because I still had to go through all the other approval process. I had bought a house, and so they had to come and do home visits there because they'd been doing them in an apartment before that. But then finally, I said yes, I will adopt Robert. Robert had been up for adoption a couple times before and had been rejected twice, both times by the mother. So this is why the case manager for his agency was looking for a single father, because they really wanted him to be adopted, but they felt that the likelihood was that his best chance was with a single dad. So I started speaking with the case managers, and they were really concerned because they did not want to subject Robert to another situation where he met a potential adoptive parent only to be rejected. As you can imagine, how tough that must have been for the little guy. He was just a 9-10-year-old at the time. And I said, the only reason I wouldn't adopt him is if I were to find out something later about him that indicated that I couldn't properly take care of him. And I said, otherwise, yes, I'm going to. So we made an arrangement that I was going to go up to Ohio in June to meet him. Had to meet him first. And as the weeks were going by and getting closer and closer to that date, they kept calling me and saying, are you sure you're going to do it? Are you sure you're going to do it? Because they were going to tell him. I made a photo album for him, sent it up to them, and then they got to the date and they showed him the photo album and told him. And then I came up and I picked him up. I met him at the home of his foster parents, which was a really lovely horse farm in Ohio, in rural Ohio. I said it was so beautiful, I hated to take him away from it. And they said, no, don't use that as a reason. He's going to be adopted, and if not by you, by somebody. So I took him for a weekend. We stayed at a hotel in the local town, went to the movies, went shopping, swimming in the pool. I'd been told that he had swimming lessons, so I thought he knew how to swim. We were in the pool, and I was in the deep end, and he was on the edge, and he went running and jumping and jumped into the deep end. And I thought he was able to swim. Suddenly I realized that his head wasn't coming up above the water. I reached over and grabbed him, and he just wrapped himself around me. And I think that pretty much solidified his attachment to me at that moment. Because I think when he realized that I was there to take care of him, he was going to be okay. So anyway, we had a good weekend. Then I took him back to the farm, and then I left. And during the subsequent 2 weeks, his therapist and psychiatrist and foster parents and case manager, everybody checked him out to see if he was um, comfortable with the idea. And me too. They checked me out, and I said yes. And finally, I drove off to Chillicothe, Ohio, and no, I'm sorry, Zanesville, Ohio, and picked him up. Spent the night in a hotel and drove home the next day. From Ohio to Georgia, you can imagine how that must have been for a little 10-year-old. Strange guy picks him up, drives him away from everything he knows. Robert had gone through this before, however, as he had spent 6 years in foster care. So he had actually been moved 5 times as a little boy. So that was in the summer, June of 2018. And we are now approaching 10 years. So that was the process leading up to his adoption and getting him to my house. I will end now and take up this narrative at another time. Except to say this, the process for adopting a child out of the foster care system is far simpler than it is adopting a child overseas, or if you're looking for a baby. Some people want to have a baby. My decision was to adopt a boy who was old enough to be able to go to school. Um, I did not want to have an infant. I wouldn't have, I just didn't think I could take care of that. The total cost to me financially was maybe $500. Um, the rest of it was all in time and effort. If you want to adopt overseas, if you want to adopt a baby, this usually costs a lot of money. But if you are interested in adopting a child, and there are so many of them in the foster care that need adoption, financially it's not that big of a deal. Emotionally, it's an amazing deal, and I would highly recommend it. So I'll do another one of these and talk about years after the adoption and see if anyone's interested. Thanks for listening.